And we're back in person and virtually. This second panel is extra hybrid. One of our presenters could not make it, but is joining us via video. They pre-recorded their presentation, so we'll be playing it over the live stream and in the room where we can see it. That first panelist is Cal Plett, and their presentation is titled One of the Good Ones, Representations of Black and Asian Religion in Western Horror Films.
Hello, everyone.
Yes.
My name is Cal Plett. I am a current graduate student in ethnomusicology at the University of California, Riverside. And today I'm going to be presenting my paper, One of the Good Ones, Representations of Black and African Religion in Western Horror Films. And just a warning, movie spoilers ahead for His House, King of the Zombies, and Get Out. Us by Jordan Peele shows a mirrored family, four main characters who live in the real world, and twins of each character who live in the underground. Horror, a genre that has been both criticized for its lack of depth and also praised for its approach towards social issues, allows us to enter the underground. What lies beneath the belly of society? What lives underground in the night and unseen until the moment it makes itself apparent? Horror creates a possibility for a critical understanding of the underground and good horrifying. It has historically represented the quote other or the quote the different as the horrifying. All the while, it has opened opportunities to address real world horrors through the supernatural and psychologically terrifying. As Horror Noir, A History of Black American Horror by author Robin Coleman explains, quote, horror has something to say about religion, science, foreigners, sexualities, power and control, class, gender roles, sources of evil, an ideal society, democracy, etc. These topics take a compelling turn when examined through the lens of Black culture. My point is, the story of Blackness, as told through horror, is a complex and interesting one. One cannot discount its unique skill at exposing the issues and concerns of our social world to include our racial sensibilities, unquote. Horror is commonly used to represent contradictions in societal values. While carefully considering the many harms of the genre, horror has also been reclaimed, representing marginalized communities as heroes, intellectuals, and saviors. Despite this, the Western-centric lens is not critical of its representation, often uncritical of what is represented as normal. In this paper, I will be addressing the Western representations of religion in horror, starting with Christian propaganda within the horror movie industry and continuing to describe the multiple and problematic representations of African and Black religions, a vast and emblematic overgeneralization, othering, and further mystifying non-Western religion. Based on multiple films, this paper considers both decolonized notions of Blackness and horror, as well as demonstrates the very homogenized representations that may appear. The horror genre in film often insinuates that the practicing of Christianity is inherently good until used for evil purposes. For non-Christian and non-Western religions, contrarily, religious practice is demonic, evil, and inherently, quote, bad, until practiced in spiritually ambiguous and socially acceptable ways, and by, quote, one of the good ones, unquote. This moralism is based directly on race and class depictions of religions. In terms of film, the horror genre does more than present its characters. It gives the audience the opportunity to decide whether or not they are worthy of surviving. Wendy Kozel explains racialized processes of viewing, quote, gazing at, in my title calls attention to the centrality of looking at another in the process of defining race. Indeed, a presumably neutral and objective gaze at race is anything but raceless. Continuing on later to explain, the presumption of neutrality reinforces the racial divisions in American society that depend on visual codes to define differences, unquote. It causes us to question, what is the colonial view and how is it inspired and represented in Western horror films? In viewing, the viewers prescribing their own biases onto what the biases of of the directors and writers are. Hooks explains that this process of viewing is also disidentifying, a common practice of Black women when watching and viewing films and media. In terms of horror's representations of Blackness in African-derived religions, disidentification is often the only option. In horror, we as the viewer are often called to view more critically. Despite this, viewing on-screen representations of non-Western religion can go awry. While representations can produce nuanced narratives that are meant to address these contradictions, the homogenization of non-Western religions often appears alongside anachronistic tendencies of the film in their depictions of Black and African religions. I argue these are incredibly damaging and may further religious discrimination. This paper addresses the dialogue between Blackness, representation of religion, and the state of horror in the West. While not free from the critiques of the films, I would argue they successfully use the genre to uplift Black stories. Coleman explains this further, saying that there are so many films featuring Blackness with so many shared conventions that Black film has itself become a genre. African, quote, religions as a category has already failed at accurate representation. There is fundamentally no such thing, just as there's no sense of a monolithic Christianity, despite being under a similar umbrella and based around a specific text. Africa is an entire continent of complex and varying religions. At the same time, there are connections embedded within religious traditions, which move across multiple continents and in the African, Afro-Latinx, and Black diaspora. Omotayo Jumaliyi argues in African religions, quote, divine essence is believed to permeate the universe. For example, Yoruba is a tradition with roots in multiple communities. As Olademo explains, Yoruba religion has also provided a foundation for a number of African-based traditions, including Cuban Santeria, Brazilian Candomblé, and Haitian Voodoo. Also known as Orisha, Yoruba religion is at the core of Yoruba lived experience and is intricately bound up in all sectors of daily life in Yoruba land and abroad in the diaspora, unquote. As Cuthbert Tagwiri succinctly explains in her article, The Horror of African Spirituality, quote, African religion has long been discussed by white writers in and from Zimbabwe in terms that were by default secular, and that these religions were not seen by the writers as a belief system, but something more like rituals or primitive cultural practices to be feared or spurned. Horror is no exception, and in fact often leans into the presuppositions of Christian conservatism, violently and willfully misunderstanding, quote, African religions in order to create a category of horror that inspires fear from the viewer. In order to understand the complex histories of these religions, we can look to the practice of witchcraft and spiritual practice and the many generative possibilities often erased when depicted in Western media, for example, in Nollywood. Jimaluyi argues that, quote, Yoruba cosmology, as expressed in Yoruba Nollywood, provides a culturally specific framework for exploring gender fluidity, spirituality, and power, unquote. It is integral to dialogue with religious and spiritual practitioners and scholars in the religious diasporas to make sure that we are not uncritically questioning the archives and media representations of living practices. Western dominant religions like Catholicism or Christianity are presented as stable, ethereal, and timeless, the only tool to be used against evil forces in these films. This enforces the idea that all other practices are not theistic and are therefore inherently profane. Real examples exist of the Catholic and Protestant Church using horror as a tool for missionizing. As Booth and Griffith et al. Say in an interview for their book, Scared Sacred, when answering the question about the recent increase in Christian representation in horror, quote, within the United States, there's a push for more diversity in film. So logically, this demand would entail films, horror or otherwise, that reflect the diverse cultural and ethnic backgrounds of many Americans. I don't think that this means there will be less Christian-themed horror films, but simply that there may be more horror films that use non-Christian themes, ideally produced by people who are culturally connected to or experts on those subjects, unquote. The reality of this statement has yet to be proven. Yet, Black people's presence in horror is undeniable, and the impact of their characters continues to be identified in new research. In Horror Noir, the documentary and the book, it deep dives by fans on social media and in the film industry help identify these narratives. One example of Western representations of racism fear or non-Christian religious practice appears in 1941's King of the Zombie. The film provides insights into the characterization of Black characters in film and the mystification of African-derived and African diasporic Black religious and spiritual practice. Magic, religion, and practices continue to be represented in a similar fashion in multiple film genres. As well, TV shows such as American Horror Story, with a complicated past of ableist and racist depictions, along many extremely graphic scenes of sexual assault, murder, and abuse, also have created new narratives around practices such as voodoo and Black spiritual practice. In the third season of the show, named Coven, Black practitioners of hoodoo and famous historical figure and voodoo practitioner Marie Laveau are integral to the plot and to the success of the primarily white coven to the show is based on. As Jennifer O'Reilly discusses, quote, through Coven circulates images that draw on stereotypes to sensationalize and demonize voodoo. It also simultaneously employs magic as a symbol of power against societal structures of oppression and therefore challenges popular perceptions and misunderstandings, unquote. The psychological effects of horror has important implications on challenging social narratives often presented in the genre. Racialized and gender tropes permeate the genre in a way that fans now understand implicitly, often being familiar enough with the genre to guess who will die and in what order. There are multiple tropes that have been written and applied to primarily Black characters in horror, aptly described in the advertisement for the film The Blackening as, "We can't all die first." In addition to Black horror movie characters often being known as the ones to, quote, die first, the genre has historically relegated Black characters to a series of tropes that demean Blackness as a tool for comedy and for depictions of violence and horror that Coleman describes as a product of their race, referring to characters acting, quote, in expense of their Blackness, unquote. Horror is based through narrative of the victim, this victimhood as a representation of the colonizer. As the book Horror Noir explains, despite the complex and rich history of Black horror and Black representations in horror, the genre often depicts violence enacted on white, cis, straight, sexually mortally bodies as more horrific. An early depiction of Black people in horror who use historically Black religious practice, voodoo, appears in the film King of the Zombies, which I showed earlier. A main character played by Manton Moreland, his comedy and timing comes at expense of his Blackness. Servants employed of the evil character Dr. Sangre, specifically a priestess who practices, quote, hoodoo and voodoo, and begins to, quote, hypnotize the main characters through spiritual methods, unquote. Whiteness is not only rendered invisible through these depictions and counter to Moreland's character, whose purpose in the film is to be frenzied with fright, while, quote, the whites around him are calm and reasoning, reinforcing dichotomies of Black emotionality and white rationality, unquote. Black characters are not a monolith in all horror. For example, 1968's The Night of the Living Dead, where the main character took charge of surviving the outbreak of zombies trapped inside a house with an all-white cast who was also trying to survive the outbreak. Of course, the film ends painfully, with Dwayne Jones, the sole survivor and leader of the survivors, being shot by police and his body tossed into a burning pile of zombie corpses. A shocking end that may have helped inspire the multiple endings of Get Out that Jordan Peele filmed, but ultimately did not keep. In His House, a debut film by Remy Weeks, the challenges of refugee treatment, PTSD, xenophobia is implicated through the haunted house trope in horror and what it might mean in terms of the human experience. The fear of immigration, refugees fleeing violence, and the practices brought with them are embedded within many horror movies and are an extension of the colonial imaginary that exists the West. Based on these considerations, the film His House allows for viewers to view what horrors exist for immigrants and the political and social environments they are forced to survive in. The film is based around Bull and Rial, who are refugees fleeing with their daughter, Niagak, from war-torn South Sudan. They travel by sea, caught in stormy weather on a crowded boat of other refugees. Although they survive their crossing, their daughter and many others do not. As noted in the title of this presentation, they are met by a caseworker when they arrive in Britain, named Mark, who tells them he hopes that they are, quote, two of the good ones, quote. We, as the viewers, watch as the two are tormented by the ghosts of those who crossed with them on their journey, but only later are shown the reality. Bull, the main character, had stolen the child of another woman as a means to escape their home in Sudan, leaving the woman to die. Relegated in Britain to a dingy, gray, small, and empty place, every sign of life and community results in profound rejection, further driving the couple deeper into isolation, into the clutches of the creature seeking revenge in their home. The haunting manifests itself through the young child the couple lost. The many village members Rial saw after surviving the massacre, and the mother of the dead child. Rial's husband, Bull, attempts to forget the past and force Rial to assimilate so they can move on. The supernatural properties of the water are a focal point of the trauma experienced by the characters. Maisha Mitchell explains this in terms of the aquatic, explaining, quote, in African religions, it is the divine itself that transmogrifies into the aquatic, making the former one of the most accessible and common parts of life. This brings the spiritual even closer to the human, making water divinities and spirits, quote, arguably the most adaptable, flexible, and innovative of all African divinities, since fluidity is of the essence of their being, unquote. Water appears frequently in the film, seeping through the walls of the dingy, rundown home that the government has temporarily offered the Sudanese couple. And I apologize, I have to skip ahead to keep in time. Black people have always been in horror, and Black and African religious practice have as well. But the expectation of Black characters to play caricatures of themselves, as well as exoticized and mystified practitioners of ancient practices, leads us to question the meaning behind his house's treatment to be one of the good ones, unquote. Though the genre of horror has been producing more explicitly Christian religions-focused films, many horror film experts are noting a new trend, one that decenters white Christian experience in horror, offering an opportunity for new representations to expand the genre. As Remy Weeks explains of his own film process, cinema, for me, is the chance to step into our dreams, the possibility to expand what we think of as reality, but never losing sense of its purpose to reflect on our own humanity. It is important to emphasize dreaming, imagination, and the, quote, good horrifying that Black filmmakers, writers, and actors have created and are creating, especially within horror. In conclusion, my research only begins to address further research that must be done on representations of religion within horror, especially those which are representing real-world religions as exotic, quote, different, the other, and anachronistic, unquote. At the same time, these representations remain within a genre that has ultimately done harm. So the answer remains as ambiguous as the ending of Us by Jordan Peele. Who is being represented and who lives in the underground? Thank you.
Okay, so I will be introducing Samantha, our next speaker. So Samantha Texan is a PhD student at UCC Edinburgh who is researching the relationship between streaming platforms and the niche anime fandom, questioning how studio marketers and fans negotiate a streaming service treatment of fan favorite content and their audiences. Furthermore, she is investigating how these interactions between streamers and anime fans affect the Asian American community. Her general research interests involve licensing anime to streaming services, Asian American representation in visual cultures, fan and audience studies, and examining mixed race depictions in media. Beyond academic writing and research, Texan can be found galloping around her beloved pop culture conventions such as her hometown San Diego Comic Con, watching anime or campy films with friends, or curl up playing video games. Am I on?
All right. Hi, I'm Samantha Tex. I'm a current PhD student in UC Annenberg's communication program. Today, I'll be covering the speculative future for Asian Americans presented in the films The One, Everything Everywhere All at Once, from here on called EEAO, and Advantageous, which all in some way rebuke or redefine techno-Orientalism. Techno-Orientalism has had a long history with science fiction media. For example, figures 2 and 3 are from the films Blade Runner 1982 and Ghost in the Shell 2017, wherein which Asian people and aesthetics are made inseparable from future technology. From Wang and Wei's book Techno-Orientalism, Imagining Asia in Speculative Fiction, History, and Media, figure 1, Techno-Orientalism can be defined as the phenomenon of imagining Asia and Asians in hyper-technological terms in cultural productions and political discourse. Techno-Orientalism imaginations are infused with the languages and codes of the technological and the futuristic. In the Western context, these futures and technologies exist as places where Asian people are reduced to tools, automata, and codes so that they cannot have power over the white hegemony. For this reason, Techno-Orientalism has often been perpetuated by non-Asian creatives as seen in figures 2 and 3, and coincides with the historical underrepresentation of Asian labor both in front of and behind the scenes in Hollywood. From this perspective, for this paper, I chose to focus on how Asian American stories deal with techno-Orientalism. So despite the trope, there does exist Asian American films that do not rely on techno-Orientalism. The One, directed by James Wong, and EAO, directed by the Daniels, Daniel Kwong and Daniel Scheinhardt, use multiversal plots and Asian actors with strong transnational star images to speculate worlds where Asian American characters can explore ideas of identity and personal relationships beyond technology. The technology within the films are not associated with the main character's Asianness. Instead, they serve as gateways into the multiple universes where they must self-reflect on their actions for the improvement of the Asian family and community. Both Lee's and Yo's association with their films provides places where their strong Hong Kong martial arts film star image give agency in the shift from technology to martial arts as a form of redefining the Asian American future. I counter my assessments of these films with Jennifer Fong's Netflix distributed film Advantageous. Rather than rejecting techno-Orientalism, that film embraces it to comment on its harms. By textually analyzing and comparing the films, I claim that Asian American creatives can both reject and embrace techno-Orientalist thinking to form stories emphasizing humanity over spectacle of technology. Humanity for Asian American science fiction is framed within the context of family and community. By seeking to improve oneself through some form of self-reflection or change, the Asian American family and community can prosper. In the worlds of The One, EAO, and Advantageous, the speculative future for Asian Americans is one where healing and empowerment within the family and not invisibility. Shown in the slide are some examples of the multiversal technology experiences in EAO, images on the left, and The One, images on the right. EAO uses the jump in which your mind can access different versions of yourself in other universes if you fulfill some task like shoving something up your butt or eating chapstick. Too much improper jumping leads to mind fracturing. The One's technology is based on wormholes that suck you into parallel universes via tech such as a watch or chair. With that in mind, let me quickly sum up the films and how they interact with the multiverse. In The One, the villainous Gabriel Yulaw, played by Jet Li, tries to become the One, an all-powerful being by jumping through the multiverse and killing all his variants. His final variant left, Gabe Law, also Jet Li, serves as the hero who must stop Yulaw from killing him, thus becoming the One. EAO features Michelle Yeoh as Evelyn, a laundromat owner trying to navigate her issues with her family in time for the Chinese New Year celebration and overdue tax filings. Pay your taxes, guys. She must jump into the multiverse to defeat the evil Jobu Tabaki, an alternate version of her daughter Joy, who can both experience and jump all of the multiverses all at once. In their research of the multiversal trend, Vera Tolman says that the multiverse highlights how the ideas of simultaneously existing and equally plausible realities complicates understandings of one unified world or universe. Tolman further states that these stories often do have hierarchical structure to them and are unfathomable to understand altogether. Both films have an alphaverse, which are seen as the most advanced ones because they develop the technology to oversee the multiverses. However, these are the same universes that end up needing help from the lesser universes from which our main characters hail, due to an issue that the Alphaverse tech had caused. Jobu's mind fractured when learning to jump into the Alphaverse, thus turning her into a villain, while Eula learned the power of the One during his tenure as the Multiverse Authority, MVA, which increased his desire for power. Because of this, unlike in other technology stories, the Asian main characters are made indispensable by the technology, since they need to use it to save the world. This tech also allows them to literally and figuratively confront aspects of themselves for self-improvement. In the end of their films, Gabe Law becomes a confident hero after defeating the evil version of himself, who also killed his wife, by the way. And Evelyn improves her family dynamics by experiencing all the multiple possibilities of her life, like that could have happened, but she chooses to accept her current one. Thus, both films are less concerned with viewers understanding their multiverses and the technologies, but more interested in how they relate to assessing personal interactions for the benefit of others. This slide is of some fight sequences from both films. On the left are images of Law and Yulaw fighting, while on the right, Evelyn fights someone that has to stick something up their butt to gain their universe's combat knowledge. So Michelle Yeoh and Jet Li are both international stars who transferred the Hong Kong action cinema scene to America's Hollywood system. Both the One and EEO consider Li and Yeoh's positions as Hong Kong martial arts stars by integrating the actors' skills and allowing their movements to be unbound from some expectations of the martial arts stereotypes. Jet Li scholar Sabrina Kiyo explains that there are stereotypes of the effeminate Chinese male image and the tough, invincible Chinese man introduced by Bruce Lee with the martial art films. Lee overcomes this in the One by working with the stunt coordinator to develop different styles of kung fu for his dual roles as Law and Yulaw. Yulaw would perform vicious strikes in an attack style, while Law practiced defensive movements. Law's defensive style overcomes the invincible masculine Yulaw style. Female stars of Hong Kong cinema research from Lisa Funnell and Auntie Kyoko and Sheldon H. Liu suggests that in the West, Asian women are oft depicted as docile and submissive, but the star power of Yeoh afforded her performances where her physical abilities were highlighted over sensuality. Yeoh's value in the West was then shaped by her continuous professional skills instead of her looks. In EOO, this shines through in her depiction of Evelyn, the woman who is reluctant to fight. Evelyn is not someone who should have martial arts skills, but gain them through verse jumping. As Yeoh switches between a reluctant fighter to a martial arts master, she expresses the same tenacity and strength she had throughout her entire film career. Ki Huang Kwan's Waymond, Evelyn's husband in the film, may be seen as closer to that submissive stereotype Yeoh and Lee often worked against. Waymond seems docile and even a bit more submissive at times to his wife. However, his strength is in resistance through passivism and embracing whatever life throws at him. Peace, in both films, end up as the ideology that is embraced, as violence is seen to not be the solution to these issues. Much like the use of the multiversal technology in the films, the glamorous, violent parts of martial arts in both films created more violence. The self-reflective and protective qualities of Kung Fu is what lets the characters heal broken worlds and communities. Jennifer Fang's Advantageous uses techno-orientalist traditions to comment on the racialized inequality imposed by the powerful technology businesses and the traumatic effects it has on families. Set in dystopian future, Gwen is a single mother and longtime salesperson who loses her job to a younger white woman. At the same time, Gwen struggles to financially support her daughter Jules' schooling, which is needs to revive a harsh world bogged down by the cycles of violence, lower birth rates, and dismissal minorities. Gwen gives her body to the previous workplace as a test for the newest cosmetic surgery, where she's technologically switched into a newer, younger, and multiracial body. Gwen's consciousness died in the procedure as she transferred to Gwen 2.0, much to the dismay of Jules. By the end of the film, Gwen 2.0 and Jules come to an understanding, which opens the possibility to peacefully coexist. Gwen 2.0 then must learn to love and care for Jules in manners different from her previous self. In their analysis of the film, Leilani Nishime writes how the body transfer discursively works against the technologist tropes by applying them to comment on it. Citing Jane Park, Nishime says that these films are yellow future movies because they include ancillary Asian female characters are more than technologists window dressing. They are films that treat Asian women as easily replaceable objects designated for lower status labor. Occasionally, the Asian women in these technologist features are technologically changed into races, mainly white women. So what this film does is that instead Gwen's journey refuses to empower white womanhood, rather it asserts that she is much more there's much more to lose as a competent, smart, and kind Asian mother than there is to gain as a universal race, mixed race figure. Furthermore, her transformation into Gwen 2.0 expresses that non-white body is exploited intersectionally by white rich corporations. Like the previous film, advantageous focuses on family and introspection. The introspection may be given to Gwen 2.0, as at the end of the film, she is open to embracing her new life with Jules, but we know that's still not the original Gwen. Gwen 1.0 is stuck in the cycle of suffering, but Gwen 2.0 and Jules are the hope for the better future. What these films differentiate on terms of treatment of the future technology, they share an emphasis on family and community. Through films like the one in EO, we seemingly break away from the traditions of techno-orientalism by creating multiversal narratives that put less weight on technology and more on the personal familial struggles the characters go through. The strong martial arts associations of the main characters within the films embrace an older stereotype marker put onto Asian people, but then put a spin on it with its own commentary about rejecting violence itself. Emphasizing martial arts assists in further rejection of technology needing to be techno-orientalist in some way. However, not all the films need to resist the thralls of techno-orientalism as advantageous embraces that past yet lands on similar themes to the one in EEO. Advantageous situates its main Asian American characters in a heavily tech-based world that forces them to sell themselves over to the technological elites. While the advanced technology is found in the Alphaverse within a multiverse in the one in EAO, advantageous exists in a dystopian future in which the main characters live in. Despite the differences of these films, tussles with technology are what leads them all to their most important objects, family. The one, EAO, and advantageous all exemplify the Asian Americans put value and effort into maintaining the family unit. As Asian people came into America, community and family is what guided most of their survival and gave comfort. So as the Asian Americans' identity formed, there was a carryover of family traditions and preserving community. This did not mean that there were not struggles or intergenerational traumas that came along in the long term. What these films are suggesting is that improving the Asian American future comes with being able to discuss the effects of duty and sacrifice as it relates back to the family. Being able to allow for personal evolutions and evaluations lets the family unit heal. The rejection or embrace of techno-orientalism by Asian American creatives cannot erase the existence of family or community. Without these pillars of the Asian American experience, there is no future. So thank you. This was just a piece of a larger course paper, and I would love any suggestions or comments. So next up is Maria Peterson. So Maria is a first-year student in the Scandinavian department at UCLA. She holds a bachelor's in education from Norwegian University of Science and Technology and a master's degree from San Francisco State University in comparative literature. Welcome, Maria. Nice.
Okay. So this is not a paper. This is more like really much work in progress. So I really appreciate any kind of comments or thoughts you have. Um, and it supposedly could be something related to my dissertation in the future or a paper. So I got into this idea of archive studies last year for one of the classes that I was taking. And I hadn't really thought much about like archives overall and what they sort of represent for a community or a society. And I started thinking about how I could think about science fiction archives, more specifically Norway. I am from Norway and I'm very interested in science fiction. And the science fiction scene in Norway is relatively small, as we'll get more into. But yeah, so this is where I'm coming at. So my topic for today is called A Space for Fabelprosa. And Fabelprosa is a term coined by Tor Åge Bringsvärd and Jon Bing, which is two very central characters, science fiction authors in Norway that sort of popularized the genre, which I will get more back to. And Fabelprosa consists of the two words fabel, meaning fable, prosa, prose or fiction. And it's like an umbrella term encompassing horror, fantasy, and science fiction. So kind of speculative fiction. So many computers. Yeah. So as you might expect, the Norwegian population is very small. So as you might expect, the market for science fiction is also thereafter. And similarly, the degree to which Norwegian science fiction is being translated into English is also affected by this. So there isn't too much that is being translated, but currently, increasingly more and more has been coming on the American or the English market. But what I believe is very interesting about researching the science fiction archive in Norway is because we see that there is every country, as you may know, like has its unique history and unique geographical position. So thinking about what specific kind of social anxieties are occurring as a relationship to technologies in each country is very interesting to think about or get a greater sense of the image of the world essentially, and especially today where things are becoming increasingly more globalized and more connected. So as you see from the picture I have here of Norway, Norway shares a border with Russia, but at the same time is very much culturally close to the US and Britain and Europe overall. It's not part of the EU, but it's part of like a EUS, which is a similar trades deal. But enough about that. This is some of the central questions that I'm interested in exploring. Some of them I will touch upon today, but they might not be explored fully today. So my questions are, was there any literary traditions and or social circumstances that laid the foundation for the genre to prosper in Norway? How was SF introduced in the country? What might have influenced the look, content of it? How was the reception? How did it differ from other literature at the time in Norway? And how does the genre differ from other genres today? What are some differences, similarities between Norwegian SF and British American SF? And what might these differences inform about the audience and issues they face in their respective countries? In what ways have the Anglophone SF tradition impacted Norwegian SF? And lastly, what is the position of SF in Norway today? How influential have the genre been in informing public opinion on technology, society, climate change, both outside, both works produced outside and inside Norway? And this is very cool. This is one of the first science fiction books. This is by Åge Bringsvärd and Jon Bing, or Mr. Drumship. My translation would be To Lose a Spaceship. Okay, so previous research, there isn't all that much, but recently there has been increasing amount. So you see the Nordic speculative fiction book just came out in 2024. But primarily, as the authors also affirm, like most of it is about Finnish science fiction because Finland has a pretty good and big scenery of speculative fiction overall. So there's only 2 articles about Norwegian science fiction, and they are both about contemporary works. But then University of Oslo has a research collaboration with other departments and other research foundations, Co-Futures, and I have a link here and I highly encourage people to go and have a look. They have like a lot of digital archives about science fiction exploration, not just in Norway, but primarily outside, like the margins, so to speak, of science fiction. And then we have Fafnir, Nordic Journal of Science Fiction and Fantasy Research, which I also encourage people to have a look at. But the similar for all of these is that they're not necessarily, or at least the two university, the co-futures and Fafnir, is that they're primarily researching non-Nordic science fiction. So this is where I believe there is a gap in the exploration of Norwegian science fiction. Okay, so what might have led Norwegian populations to be inclined to read science fiction in the first place? And what I want to mention is that the saga literature that is called the Icelandic sagas, written down around 13th and 14th century, and these are essentially explorations of they could be explorations of the Norwegian kings, or also they contain sagas about dwarves, trolls. So what we see is there's already an interest in the supernatural, and this we see today, even though the Nordic countries are very much secularized. There's still a really high interest in the supernatural as a way to explain phenomena, which is pretty interesting. And I have a quote here. Northern myths, as J.R.R. Tolkien referred to them, reflect a long tradition in the region for visiting, quote, worlds located somewhere apart, quote, and exploring, quote, a larger reality. And a little bit about pre-science fiction. Here I just have a list of what has been considered pre-science fiction from other countries. So you see the ones in yellow are international works, Thomas More, Utopia, Jonathan Swift, Gulliver Travels. And then we have the Danish Norwegian Ludvig Holberg. He's Danish Norwegian because Norway was occupied for greater parts of this history by Denmark and then Sweden. So Neil Keelim's Underground Travels is essentially a story about a man in Bergen, a big city in Norway, who one day falls down into a hole in the earth and comes to a new planet, essentially called Mazar, where he meets enters a population where men and females are equal, which he finds very circumspect. And the story ends with him coming back to Bergen. And it has been noted by James Gunn, which has been a central figure in the science fiction world, that Jules Verne was very much inspired by Ludwig Holberg's story for when he wrote not the one that is mentioned here, but the journey to the I forget the title, but not this one, but the most astonishing one. Yeah, the center of the earth. Thank you. And then we have Henrik Wergeland, which also is a Norwegian author, very central figure in the nationalistic movement. The Siste Kloge, The Last Vice, which similarly is a story about like someone coming to a new planet called Terra Nova, or an island. So what you see is that these works are obviously not categorized as science fiction because the term wasn't invented as such, but that there's already an interest in exploring fantastical realms as a way of thinking about the society in Norway. And then we're moving further towards our time. And some of these has been categorized as science fiction and some was not publicized as science fiction. But then we have the first one, Stoppes det evigheten, which was the first one that was marketed as a science fiction novel. Then we have Jens Crosses Space. Then we have The Journey to Ken. And we have The Athens Plays, a novel from 2025. But what all of these have in common is that they weren't really enough to popularize the genre. They came out and they were very much well received, but still people didn't really pick up the genre, even though it existed as a genre outside of Norway. And what I want to think a little bit about is like why there was an interest already for these kinds of genres. And I want to mention the fact that Norway had some very central explorers that went around in the world and explored places that for some places were already explored. But we have Fridtjof Nansen, Roald Amundsen, which was the first person to go to the South Pole, and Thor Heyerdahl. And this very much shows that there were already an interest in exploring the unknown. And in terms of the technological invention, I want to mention that because of Norway's central position, or culturally central position next to the UK, led to it having a lot of influence from these countries. So we have the telephone lines. Only after a year, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone phone. He came to visit Norway, where he demonstrated his invention. And only a couple of years later, the first telephone lines were installed in Norway. And then there was a lot of different companies that was brought up in Norway at the same time. But one of them is Tandberg Company, founded in 1933. And I believe that John F. Kennedy actually used the Tandberg recorder when he worked as a president, which shows that even a small country's invention can have an impact outside, and also shows that technological inventions was up and coming in Norway, which might have led to people being interested in exploring what this kind of technology would do to a small society like Norway. And I have a quote here: science fiction questions the role, relevance, costs, and benefits of current and future technologies and present ideas that can influence public opinion, says Christopher Benjamin Menandua and Karen Dian. So this is just a way to show like why people would be inclined to move towards genres like science fiction to begin with. And this is where fabelprosa really comes to become popularized in Norway in the mid 60s. And a lot of it is like slipstream-like. It's a little weird, doesn't necessarily fit into category, easily into the category of science fiction, but it could still be very much defined as science fiction. And this is the first novel by Bing and Bringsværd. They wrote together, and they also were really prolific writers on their own. This is their novel Around the Sun in the Circle, which has been translated, and it's a picture of them here. So Jon Bing was also a professor at the University of Oslo. He was a professor in law in information technologies, so very much relevant, and which has led to him producing a lot of fiction about like sort of like talking about what should we do about the ethics around developing technologies. And I have one example here, which has not been translated, but it's called like Hva data, or What Data. And I love the cover, which is just this person probably looking around in a big computerized room. Yeah, so the golden era for Norwegian science fiction was essentially in the 70s and 80s. And similarly, there was being established a Oslo Science Fiction and Fantasy Society by Bing and P.G. Olsen, where they also made a official science fiction journal, Algernon, which from 1974 to 1998 ran, and I have an example of their first journal here. And you can actually go and access the journals for free. They're being digitalized. I have the link here. So for those who speak Norwegian, go and read it. It's actually really interesting, and I'm sure you could find a way to translate it. And the organization is still active today. Okay, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about, and please, if someone is keeping time, please let me know when I have 2 minutes or something left. But one thing that I find really interesting, and I'm sure that a lot of you can agree, is this idea of like how science fiction is being marketed through the times. And you have here in the middle, I have the first edition of C.S. Lewis' Perelandra. And you see the cover is pretty much just like a blue, a picture of an island. And then we move to an edition from the 1965, which it becomes more like psychedelic, interesting, a lot of colors. And you can see that the Norwegian edition that I have here looks very much similar to the 1965 version. So what I want to say is that in collaboration with Bring and Birgesvei, one of the biggest publishing houses in Norway started to publish a series of science fiction that was both like translated English works, but it also offered a big platform for Norwegian science fiction writers to come and produce science fiction in the Norwegian context about Norwegian anxieties. They were called Lanterne science fiction, and all of their illustrations, the covers were illustrated by Peter Haars, which is a German Norwegian graphic designer. And here I have some of the graphics, and as you can see, it has the same psychedelic, like weird vibe to it, which I find really interesting, thinking about what it might have meant to introduce the genre in Norway in this way, because it clearly appeals to a certain audience and perhaps not others. And I had this picture of Frank R. Pohl, which was the illustrator for Hugo Gernsback, Amazing Stories, from 1926 and 1965, 68, a little back and forth. But as you can see here too, it's like a use of very strong colors, and it clearly, when you look at it in a bookstore, it would really be distinguished from all the other kinds of literatures or magazines. But what was different for the Norwegian, obviously, was that there wasn't already an established market for science fiction in Norway. So by introducing the genre in Norway like this, you are really much like marketing yourself towards a specific audience. And this is some of the, also Peter Haars, but this is the translated versions. And then I come to this, I was doing some research on different covers, and then I found this, which was the Penguin covers, and it's Alan Aldrich, which was the art director at Penguin Publishing House from 1965 to 1967. And it really can't be no doubt that the Norwegian Peter Haars was really much inspired, given the similar like black background, and you have this like trippy, wild kind of illustration on the cover. And then we move further and we find David Pelham, which was the art director after him, from 1968 to 1967, 68. And it's a similar, like the paintbrush towards the white background, wild, trippy, strange kind of illustrations. And then I'm moving from there to the heyday in Norway science fiction scene to today. And I have this quote, it is perhaps impossible to overemphasize the role of cover art in defining and marketing magazines as both an indicator of content and as a means of attracting attention and readers. It follows that cover art must conform to the expectation of its time. And here I just have two novels of Tor Åge Bringsværd, Caravane and Kintsugi from 2021. And it really makes me question, like, yeah, why has there been such a shift in cover art photos for science fiction? And I believe we see this too in the Anglophone market as well. Yeah, and this is to move to someone else in the contemporary market in Norway. And this, people might be familiar with Maja Lunde. She's actually been translated and has gained some attention internationally for her science fiction works. But as we see, like, these are very much, they could fall into the category of any kind of book. So they could be a romance, or they could be a drama. So the History of Beasts, The End of Ocean, The Last Wild Horses, The Dream of the Tree are all part of her Spring Quartet. So it's essentially like cli-fi, like talking about dystopic, like climate change effects. And then I wanted to move further, think about contemporary. These are also contemporary works. And Strek gjennom tyngdekraften is an anthology. Nordic Visions are also an anthology and has been marketized in the US, so for an Anglophone audience. And what we see here is that these are both, a lot of female writers in Norway are starting to write science fiction. So this contrasts with the heavily, the golden era, which was pretty much dominated by male writers in Norway, and as it was for the Anglophone science fiction canon. And then I'm touching briefly upon Norwegian science fiction television, which is very small. We have Green Passasjer, the starship Marco Polo, which is the one to the right here, essentially about someone in a spaceship. I have some pictures here. Someone in a spaceship who is traversing towards some extraordinary planet to explore different cultures. where there is someone in the ship that turns out is not supposed to be there. And interestingly, it very much, this is from 1978. And 1 year later, Ridley Scott's Alien comes, 1979, and it has the same kind of like structure. I found a YouTube movie of someone who's just comparing the two, and they're very much similar. But I'm sure, I think I read somewhere that also the Norwegian obviously has been very much inspired by Scott no, it's a Rubik. Yes. 2000 Space, the Space Odyssey. Kubrick, yes. So that explains, like, maybe there's some similarities there too. But anyway, what we have really recently is Beforeigners, and I very much encourage people to go and have a look at it. It's very interesting in terms of like linguistically too. So it essentially is about Norwegians coming from the past into the present. So there's like a time travel element where people from Viking Age and the Stone Age and 18th century Norway are coming back through the Oslo fjord mysteriously. And then they all have to learn how to coexist in present day Norway, where then different cultural expectations and norm are mixed here. And what is very, I mean, a lot can be said about the Netflix streaming platform services, but for a small television market like Norway, it really has been central and important because it has allowed science fiction, which the smaller news channels in Norway wouldn't necessarily want to risk taking on as a project, because it could be potentially, you wouldn't have enough like audiences to sustain those kinds of projects. But so this is Beforeigners is supported by HBO Max, which then can reach a broader audience and popularize science fiction from Norway to a broader audience, which is, I think it's great. And I'm hoping that they will do more such projects. Yeah, so just some short concluding thoughts. I don't really have a lot of concluding thoughts at the moment, but I guess what I want to say is that I'm very excited about furthering this project more. And for those who are traveling in Scandinavia in the summer, there is NorCon, the Norwegian Convention for Science Fiction, 13 to 15 of June. So I encourage you all to come. Yeah. What do you want me to do? Should I take care of this?
I will take this mic to whoever would like to pose the first question in person, and encourage everybody on the Zoom live stream to use the Q&A feature. It's worth it.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. My question is for Samantha. I am really interested in the films that you're placing in conversation together. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about Advantageous and kind of the presence of I remember there's one particular scene where the mother comes across a houseless woman who talks about selling parts of her body, I think selling her eggs, if I'm remembering correctly. And I'm wondering if you could talk about kind of the kind of dystopic, like hyper-capitalist future that film is engaging with, as kind of framing two ways to sell for women to sell their bodies, but one is kind of deemed somehow reparable or somehow posing a future for her daughter, while the other is kind of entrenched in this houselessness.
Hello. I had two questions, one for Samantha and then one for you. The first question I had for Samantha, you mentioned in your slides that there was a piece of storytelling that was focused on fight choreography specifically between you, Law, and Law. Do you have more to say about the use of fight choreography in specifically techno-orientist media to subvert expectation of stereotype? Thank you. And then for Maria, I had a quick question regarding I don't know a lot about the sci-fi genre in the place you're speaking on, but I'm interested. A lot of the pieces talked about journeying to different places, and I'm wondering if you think that is related to if you think the sci-fi in that area is is affected by the culture, if there's something in the culture at the time that was colonial or like really interested in journeying outside of its realms or boundaries. Is that something that you could speak on?
I mean, the literature isn't like extensive. Obviously, I just post like two works and the yeah, there isn't like an extensive amount of examples that could like really offer concluding or like satisfactory answer to that. But I think there definitely was, because I think like travel literature overall, like in the Anglophone canon as well, like sort of like points to that the travel literature was sort of like a pre what do you call it, like a prelude before science fiction really took off. Like, and obviously it makes sense, like in the sense that before there really was technology, you before that you're interested in what's unknown and exploring like what are the consequences of exploring the unknown, like what happens when we go to these places that are not unexplored but like unknown to us as individuals or as society. And it's, I guess, like thinking about like, wow, what would it be to come to the society where men and women are equals, like how weird. And it's it is really interesting to think about what it must have been to live in an era where there was actually like unexplored territory. Yeah, and sort of like play with that. Yeah, but I don't really know if I can like I cannot with confidence say that yes, this is what the author meant. And obviously the people who were in the position to actually write and publish were already pretty wealthy. What is interesting about the one that the Ludwig Holberg novel was that it was actually first written and published in Latin because they thought that the content would be too provocative for a Norwegian Danish audience, which is pretty interesting.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you all for your presentations. I had a question for Cal. Is Cal still with us? No?
No.
Oh,
No.
that was it. Yeah, okay. Well, yeah. One of the things I was really interested in, there was something Cal had mentioned about are there a lot of films that are showing these other religious cosmologies? And just something that I wanted to mention for reference is that for Black film, and I'm sure this is probably true of other communities as well, there are actually a lot of films that show African cosmologies, but they're just not necessarily films that are understood within the horror genre, while they might absolutely be horror, or could be read as horror, right? Because of sort of the racialization of genres. So something like Jonathan Demm's Beloved, or Haile Gerima Sankofa, or Eve's Bayou, like there are quite a few things. So just in terms of the archive to think about that. But I really enjoyed that one. I can't talk to them.
There's a question from the Q&A on Zoom, which is, I think, directed at Maria. A lot of early US and UK science fiction, at least like published specifically within the genre for that market, was aimed at children. Was this true for Norway?
As far as I know, that was not the case. Like one of the books that I mentioned was Jens Reise til Jens Crosses Space, I think was the English translation. But that is one of 2 young adult novels that I found so far that was published. It is interesting that it was published at the same time in like 1954, which is pretty early. It was before Jon Bing and Tor Åge Bringsvärd started really publishing. But overall, no, like the biggest audience was for an adult audience, and the topics really speaks to that. Although I'm sure like a lot of young adult readers did read their novels. But yeah, interesting question. And I want to note that down just in case, because it might be that maybe like even picture books were exploring these things in more depth. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for those really interesting papers. Another question for Maria, sorry to bombard you, but I loved your analysis of covers and cover design in the history of science fiction, which is so important. And I was curious, the golden age that you mentioned of the 70s and the 80s sort of coincides in the West with the new wave tradition, right? Where science fiction is moving away from the sort of bombast, boys' adventures, into a more sort of philosophical, intellectual, elevated space, ostensibly, right? So you do get things that are trippy and weird and slipstream in the ways that you talked about. And I was just wondering about the texts that were translated into Norwegian from Anglophone authors versus the actual text from Norwegian authors that were also published at the time. Were they of a similar kind of slipstream style still, or are they more explicitly like the adventure sort of format of the classic golden age science fiction?
That's an excellent question. And they were very much slipstream. Like the Tor Åge Bringsvärd and Jon Bing was very much inspired by the American, or like the biggest canons. Like Ray Bradbury was a huge inspiration for them. And Tor Åge Bringsvärd has been considered like the little brother of Kurt Vonnegut in terms of like how he writes. And it's very much like weird is how I would like characterize, especially Tor Åge Bringsvärd, which is still writing today. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
I will check the Zoom. We have answered the question that is in the Zoom Q&A. We have time for maybe one more in the room before we break for lunch. Okay.
Thank you. So I'll just stand. My name is Maria. First off, I really enjoyed all of the panelists and watching and listening to your presentations. My question is for Samantha. I'm really curious about how, with everything everywhere all at once, how possibly certain elements of the genre in itself and how the film's like composed, because it draws from like surrealist style, absurdist style, and also elements of like fantasy, how these particular genres maybe within their very like characterizations itself offer ways of like distancing the like this imagination of the Asian body very closely with this high-tech futuristic setting. Like if there is something about the element of fantasy or these other styles that allow for like a kind of science fiction where there isn't a confluence, like an immediate confluence of the Asian body with the high-tech world. Yeah, that's something I'm really curious about. If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I love that question because, thinking about that more, I think because there was like, it's a weird film for anyone who's seen it. It's very strange. It doesn't follow, I want to say, the other, our classic like Marvel multiverse or like DC multiverse, but it just looks like the other world, but a little different. That I believe it does just is able to just because able to do like weird tech or something beyond technology as we traditionally think of ourselves. So not just like computers hooked up, but the fact that like to do any of these weird things, again, like eating the chapstick, slapping someone, confessing your love, are all very just away from that traditional techno orientalism. That it does allow for, I think, because of that surrealist and fantasy factor, you can imagine things even beyond just being like what normal tech looks, but also just imagine different forms of Asianness. Because even in that film, we see they become rocks, they become other figures that are very distanced away from, I want to say, traditional images that were usually meant to make fellow Asian people like lesser than, but instead like embrace some of those while changing different ones. So I think yes, the surrealist and fantasy genre does just allow for the multitudes of weirdness that isn't maybe as always functional in like the traditional like tech film. So it can go beyond what we see as tech, but also an application, but also just literally is able to go beyond by virtue of its kind of weirdness that is baked into surrealist and fantasy media. But thank you for the question.
Let's thank our panelists.